as we come now to the 16th week of the church year, and the readings are, first reading comes from the book of Wisdom, chapter 12, verses 13, and then verses 16 and through 19. From the letter of Paul to the Romans, chapter 8, verses 26 and 27, and from the gospel tradition of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 24 through 43. Now, the gospel verses continue what we began last time. Remember a series of parables that Jesus is teaching with regard to the nature of the kingdom of heaven. This time, actually we're listening to a number of parables. The arrangement here in let's put it into a little perspective. Verses 24 through 30 is a parable about weeds and wheat. This is followed in verses 31 through 32 in the parable about a mustard seed, and this is followed in verse 33, the use of yeast put into flour. And then verses 34 through 35 is another explanation given by Jesus or Matthew as to why parables are used. And then finally, verses 36 through 43 are a secondary interpretation of the weeds and the wheat, which, as we noticed last time, also happened, and this is known as allegory. So, all of that is a little bit the structure, which is kind of interesting here. The initial parable that we're looking at is weeds and wheat. The parable, simply, you will remember, is that weeds are sown by someone, presumably the owner of the field, wheat, and among the wheat begins to grow up weeds. And so then the dilemma is, or the question raised is, what do you do with the weeds? And that, of course, is the background for this particular parable. Now, once again, knowing a little bit of the culture of the times can be important. Experts who study these things describe Mediterranean society as basically being antagonistic. That is, they're hostile or they're conflict-oriented. That's a little different than the way perhaps in which we imagine things to be then, or that we imagine things to be now, although I suspect that we are often very antagonistically oriented. The opening parable, therefore, suggests when the question is raised to the owner about the weeds growing up, that perhaps an enemy has sown these weeds among the wheat. Now, it is true, you see, that in this culture, by birth of a family, you not only got everything that belonged to the family, that is, the good things, the honor status that belonged to a family. And remember, we've spoken frequently about the importance of honor as one of the cultural values of the Mediterranean first century world. But you also, along with the friends that you inherited as a member of a family, you inherited their enemies. So it's a package deal that really came to a person. So this state of feuding develops and persists in this culture over a long period of time. And no one really knows but who is responsible for things going awry, but suspects that a family enemy is seeking to shame one's family. So here we are to the basic code of honor and shame. So if, indeed, weeds grow up in the wheat field that has been planted and nothing is done about it, Don't the neighbors laugh at this? See, he doesn't know how to plant the right things. He plants both good and bad. And that, of course, is also part of the interpretation we will see of this parable, the reality of good and wrong, good and bad, good and evil surviving in the world. Now, what is expected, and this, of course, lies behind this, that if indeed an enemy has done something to the owner's field by planting weeds among his wheat, that there will be retaliation. He will get back at them. He will find a way for the harm that he has caused them to cause them harm. All right, and that again is the cultural background for what's going on here. Now, what is the owner supposed to do? As the weeds are growing up, the servants, the slaves, come and say, did you not, they raise the question with him, plant good seed in your field? Now keep in mind, some also point out that perhaps the tenants, that is, who are working the field for the owner, are a little afraid that they might be accused of putting the weeds into the wheat field. So they kind of throw the accusation to the owner. Now, he surprises them, and this, of course, is how the parable develops. When they ask what to do with regard to the weeds that are now appearing, says to the kind of workers of the field, let them alone. Let the weeds and the wheat grow together, and then when harvest time comes, when the weeds are fully grown and the wheat is fully grown, you will go among the field and separate the weeds from the wheat. You will bundle up the weeds and use it, and interestingly, use it for fuel. See, burn it. Of course, it does mean go out into the field and burn it, but use it at the appropriate time when you need fuel. So that is his suggestion. Now, let's look again. Was this such a wise decision on the part of the landowner to let the weeds grow with the wheat? No, because anyone who was familiar with farming, and this may have been a little bit also the background here, that the tenants who worked the land were saying to the owner, who may not have been such a good farmer, does he really know what he's doing? Because as the weeds grow up with the wheat, they draw from the soil the necessary strengths that the wheat needs. They draw moisture, they draw the nourishments that are found in the soil, and they also take up space, which would begin to choke the wheat. So the ordinary suggestion would be is to get the weeds at the beginning before they get a chance to grow and develop. And that would have been and was one of the things. Now, it's a lot of work, but it needed to be done in order to guarantee that the wheat would grow certainly strong and come to maturity. So when we say, oh, he just lets both of them grow together, isn't he kind? See, from one point of view, this wasn't a very wise decision on the part of the owner of the wheat field. Now, on the other hand, everyone will kind of watch to see what happens. Could the owner be correct? Could it be that both would be grown to maturity, that both would come to full blossom? And now, see, in a certain way, they would be kind of, wait a minute, the owner has been much more clever than perhaps was thought. Not only does he get the wheat, which is the crop that had been planted, but now he has the weeds, and he also gets extra, something that he can use, as I mentioned before, a little bit later on. So maybe the owner of the field is a little bit more sharp or better management than they had thought. So those are some possible explanations. Again, who sows the seeds of the of the weeds into the field. Could have been an enemy. Well, he says an enemy, but as we mentioned, is this a long-standing enemy, as we mentioned at the beginning here today in our discussion, or is this a more recent enemy? And the refusal on the part of the owner to retaliate is, of course, perhaps a question of honor, and that's why the result of this parable, or what happens to the wheat, becomes importantly. If there is a favorable outcome, well, then the owner looks to be in good stead, and honor is preserved for he and his family. If, however, it doesn't work, well, then he has brought dishonor and shame to his family, and he has let the enemy have, whoever sowed this seed, have his day or have his triumph. So, and one of the things as we hear this parable, and again, what we notice here is that this probably is the original parable, may well have been one that Jesus himself used. We don't really know the result of this on the part of decision, rather on the part of the owner. We assume that everything will work out well, but is that an assumption, or is, as good parables are geared, a bit open-ended? So those are a number of the kind of questions that emerge here. We do know something about the weeds. The weeds would be known as darnel, D-A-R-N-E-L. And it is true that this seed looks very similar to the wheat seed and was poisonous. So therefore, if it interacted too much with the wheat as it's growing, could destroy it or make it not at all valuable or useful for people to eat. So you see, from this point of view, it was a not very wise decision on the part of the owner to let the wheat and the weed grow together. So what is the hearer to think as he or she hears this parable? If you were the slaves, well, would they not have questioned, as I mentioned, the wisdom of the householder? If it's the proprietor, has he simply gotten greedy, as we've mentioned? Does here's the ultimate question, householder really have farming knowledge himself, or is he simply imprudent and hoping that things are going to work out well? So there's a lot that you can see of interpretation that might go on with regard to the process here. Now, certainly as the gospel presents it, the understanding certainly that we see here is that Jesus is well aware that good and evil, right and wrong exist in the world, and rather than trying to root it out, maybe to let it grow together, because perhaps, and this might be one of the points of the parable, that perhaps the weed as it comes to maturity might, if this, and here let us go now to an allegorical interpretation of this particular parable, jump to the end of the verses that we're hearing this time. As I mentioned, these would be the last verses of the section that we hear this week. First of all, as it is presented, this would be, as I mentioned, an allegorical interpretation. There is a shift of audience. The audience has now moved from the crowds to Jesus' disciples. And as is always the case in allegories, each item in the story is given a specific meaning or assigned a symbolic meaning. So in this case, the sower is the Son of Humanity, or more popularly the phrase, Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one. The enemy is the devil. The harvest is at the end of the age. The reapers are the angels, and the tone is what we call apocalyptic, namely, it looks to a final judgment that will come at some future time. So, see, this is now how we're going to get allegorical and give it all this kind of special meaning. And so, therefore, what is important, according to this interpretation, is patience. Patience, forbearance, to let things develop. The moment of crisis is not the appearance of the weeds, but their final horrible demise. So you see, let them grow. If they don't turn out to be anything but weeds, zapped, and they will be good for nothing else but fuel. So that is an interpretation. Now, when we say an allegorical interpretation, which probably would not be, no offense here, but not one that Jesus would have used. The more important part would have been, as we mentioned before, the original intent of the parable. So there you have a very interesting analogy, wheat and weeds. And we would certainly like to have known, and every interpreter perhaps of this parable does think that she or he knows the conclusion as to whether it turned out to be successful. So there you have it. In verse 37, single verse here, Jesus is referred to, now some authors here speak of the title given to Jesus as the Son of Humanity. We, of course, are more familiar in the text that we hear, Son of Man. It is an interesting figure. The question that is raised here, and we'll just bring it to a little bit of a discussion, when Jesus says that the Son of Man will do these things, is he referring to himself? Is this a self-title that Jesus is giving? Or is Son of Man referring to another figure? And there are some interpreters, particularly the Son of Man image first appeared, you remember, in the book of Daniel, which is the last recognized book of the Hebrew collection. But in the book of Daniel, there says that there will appear one like the Son of Man. Now, and there, of course, you have the question of the word like a Son of Man. What exactly does that mean? So some say that this particular verse that Jesus uses could be, although that is probably not the general way of understanding it, another figure yet to come, or is this a title that Jesus receives himself or that describes who he is, the Son of Man? And I think that's the ordinary way in which that is interpreted, but I do bring that little point of discussion up for the sake of a biblical point of view. Now, verses 31 through 32 talk about the mysterious mustard seed. In this case, there is of course, we've seen this used in other Gospels. It is a small seed, sometimes referred to as the smallest of seeds, although that isn't really the case, but it is really a small seed. And in this case, it is sown, and in this case, the small seed becomes a large tree in which the birds of the air can reside. So one of the reasons why here can usual interpretation is from a very small seed grows something that is, well, if you think about it. Now, when we think of a tree, please do not think of giant oak trees, but think of trees looking here at the ground coming about this height, okay? So is that a bush or a tree? Now, again, that perhaps is a question of interpretation, but the birds of the air certainly could settle in, despite the height, in its branches, and that, of course, is the point that from a small seed comes an enormous bush or an enormous tree. The verse 33 talks about leaven. Now, this would be interesting. We don't very often have parables that are connected with the everyday life of a woman. Now, leaven would be something that she would be familiar with, and this might be one of those few cases where Matthew has both a male and a female imagery to help kind of develop his message. This, you remember, is much more characteristic of the Lucan gospel, but here, at least one can in fairness say, Matthew is aware of this. Now, is the leaven, therefore, and this will raise a smile on some, a female image of God? Because there is something here that does get your attention. It is a grandiose amount of flour. Now, so we're talking about the leaven, that is the yeast, being placed in the flour. The amount of flour here is 3 measures of flour. Now, I'm not sure you're aware of what that would be, but that's approximately 50 pounds of wheat, of flour rather. That's a little bit of a lot. Well, you're saying I've carried 50-pound bags of flour. All right, but it still was a lot. And into this is placed this leaven, and you get this tremendous growth. Now, part of this, and this idea of leaven, Matthew, it's always, as we've pointed out a number of times, is very familiar with the Old Testament, with the Hebrew Bible. Remembers that certain women in the or well, not just women, but figures in the Old Testament, Sarah, whom you remember, the wife of Abraham, when 3 guests appear, goes to make bread for them, bakes, you got it, 50 or 3 measures of flour. Gideon, who, one of the judges, questioning whether or not he had a mission from God, prepares a sacrifice for God using this same amount of flour. And then Hannah, who is the mother of Samuel, when she wanted to thank God for the gift of her son, also returns to the temple at Shiloh with a similar amount of bread. So there is a connection here with the use of the imagery of leaven and the amount that takes place. Some say that this great amount of bread growing up here is an epiphany, a showing forth, as we've mentioned before, a manifestation of God. So those are the concluding parables here. All of them in some ways do have, if you think about it, to do with growth. The wheat, the little seed mustard, and the leaven all have to do with growth. And perhaps, and this is one of the ways in which often this section of Matthew's story is interpreted, reflecting another idea that is found in other synoptic writers. It's not exclusive to Matthew, but it certainly is important to Matthew's story, that from a small setting, a small group, or a small beginning, a large expansion will take place. Now, whether or not in Matthew's time already, small groups of believers in Jesus had taken place, and we believe that this had happened. We mentioned this before, so that Matthew's community, therefore, would have been encouraged, that although maybe they're not making the significant great advances that they hoped might happen. Nevertheless, the kingdom is spreading, and that the work of Jesus is being carried out by them and will grow and will expand. And at the end of this gospel, jumping to the very end, you remember that Jesus sends his disciples into the whole world. Therefore, the message is not just for one group of people or a certain group of believers, but is intended for all. The first reading comes from the book of Wisdom, which we have noted before was a collection of sayings written somewhere between the year 100 and between the year 50 before the Common Time. So this would have been a relatively close work to the time of Jesus and to the writing of New Testament works. The book was written, or the collection of wisdom sayings really, was to remind young intellectuals, now we would presume that they would have been of a little better social status, rather, of people, of the relevance of traditional Judaic beliefs and principles, and that they were compatible with Greek wisdom. Now, you remember that at this time, about roughly 200 years before Jesus' time, the Hellenic worldview of culture was gaining a popularity among many in the Hebraic community. And so, what is being encouraged in the little section that we hear this time is that they reflect upon the toleration and moderation that God exhibits in the exercise of divine power. God, and this would be different than what the Hellenic culture pointed out, God tempers power with mercy and does not use it against the innocent. So it's a word of encouragement, particularly that those who may find themselves suffering from difficulties because of power, of structures over them, should remember that God's power has power too, but as I mentioned, it is with mercy, and therefore the encouragement that justice should always be measured with clemency. Israel is to learn from its God that it can afford to be just because of its strength. And this was a very important message, certainly passed on, if we think about it, to Jesus as he was growing up. And we think often, certainly his teachings would be very important, and in some ways he has many unique characteristics to it, but in fairness to the religion and to the beliefs that Jesus grew up with, God's mercy, God's clemency, God's patience was also there and being taught to those who came to believe and accept the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So maybe to keep all of that in mind. So as we hear this time very beautiful images of growth that will take place ultimately, be patient, be careful about trying to retaliate immediately, and going back to the very beginning here, isn't the natural reaction sometimes if someone does you harm, get back at them? Well, maybe the tolerance, the mercy, the forbearance that Jesus pictures, which he learned, as I suggested, as he was growing up, also have a merit and a value in our own time, that it would be in his time, but also as we take this to heart, as we hear these beautiful parables of growth. The growth of God's goodness continues to happen now as it did then. And for an openness to these gifts, we once again seek the help and support of the Lord this day. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.